Jonny Thomson is a philosopher and writer. His first book, Mini Philosophy, is an international bestseller and has been translated into 22 languages. He taught in Oxford for more than 10 years before working full-time as a staff writer at Big Think. Jonny, welcome to the show. Great to have you here.
Oh, thanks for having me on, Brad. I'm really excited about it. Thank you.
Excellent. Perhaps as a starting point, you could share a little bit about your journey and what led to you becoming interested in philosophy.
Yeah, sure. So for me, actually, it was an inspirational teacher, really. Because when I was at school, my kind of real passions were history and English literature. And then I'd had the right teacher at the right time who absolutely knew how to, well, to A, teach philosophy, but B, he kind of knew me. Like I can tend to be a bit lazy, and so he knew exactly kind of like what to do. And basically, it was the stick, but and it really worked. I mean, not literally the stick. I mean, I think I've been in the league in the UK for a while, but it's yeah. So he kind of knew exactly how to kind of like to kind of push me and to challenge me and to test me. And so I suspect my first forays into philosophy were really just to impress him, actually. But then then the bug kind of stuck in, really. I started reading Nietzsche actually first. The first kind of major philosopher who wasn't on the kind of like on the syllabus at school was Nietzsche. And I mean, there's a lot I kind of disagree with what he says now, but at the time when you're like a young 16, 17-year-old reading Nietzsche, it's really exciting. I mean, he's deliberately provocative. He deliberately kind of challenges you, and when you're reading it, you're like, wow, this is quite exciting. The language is hard to understand for a 16-year-old and 17-year-old, but you still get the kind of like this mixture of anger and prodding and testing and the kind of the wink and the kind of like, the questions that he's asking. And that kind of stuck with me. And to be honest, that feeling hasn't really left me. That Nietzsche feeling I get it with some other philosophers a little bit now. I get it with the French existentialists, but that original, that feeling that Nietzsche gave me hasn't really kind of like changed. And since after that, as I say, the bug set in, and I started expanding into your big names like Plato and Descartes and Aristotle and all that lot. So I went to university and I studied philosophy, and I specialised in Wittgenstein, who does philosophy of language, and then I ended up down in Oxford where I taught philosophy for 12 years, and then I ended up doing his Instagram account on the side, which is called Mini Philosophy, where I kind of explain philosophical ideas and in about 2,200 characters and a little image. And then from there I got a book, and my agent liked the idea enough, and it's turned into a vaguely successful book, which then let me go make the transition to full-time writing. And now I'm very happily writing for a company called Big Think in America and the John Templeton Foundation. And it's just a dream. Like in this day and age, very few people can write, make a living by writing, and I'm absolutely living the dream here. So I'm at home with my two young kids, and I get to philosophize and write about philosophy. So that's where we are now, in my home in North Oxfordshire, writing about philosophy, talking to you. So sorry if that's a bit too much of a ramble for you.
Not at all. Not at all. That's an amazing journey. And I love that idea of the wink from a philosopher from the past who knows that if someone is dedicated enough and takes the time to really understand, there are little subtle jokes in there, and there are messages that are transmitted through decades and centuries. It's really interesting to think of these people. We often think of philosophers as just these names. I mean, they're just these really influential figures from the past, but we forget that they were real people who were mischievous and who had families and who had complex lives, and they just passed down some really important ideas. And great that you're there now doing the same.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true, and I guess there's a kind of meta debate in kind of all academia, really, in terms of how much you should treat the biography of a person as you're looking at their ideas and as you're unpacking their work. And I would say with philosophy, it does depend on the philosopher. I'd say, like, I think if some philosophers are in the business of talking about maybe ethics or the kind of more human side of philosophy, like existentialism and ethics and the meaning of life and all that kind of stuff, I think that maybe their biography should at least kind of like interpret that in what they're saying quite a lot. I mean, a case study for that would be a guy called Søren Kierkegaard, who's a Danish 19th century philosopher, and he deliberately wrote in a very enigmatic way. you're not really sure what he's saying, and his kind of like his works are very contradictory, deliberately so. He's trying to invite you, the reader, to develop your own ideas and stuff. And I think when you look into his life and what he personally went through, I think you can really get a good kind of handle on what he means a bit more. Because he himself was very troubled, and he, for example, he broke up a relationship with his fiancée called Regine Olsen, for example. And I think knowing all of this kind of actually does slightly flavor his work a little bit. Whereas I think if you're looking at some other philosophers, possibly like someone like Descartes or even Plato, maybe who are dealing more in abstract philosophy and more even analytic philosophy, someone like Wittgenstein, I'll possibly say their biographies matter a bit less. But hugely interesting characters. As just a side hobby, I just love reading their biographies anyway, because they're deeply human, deeply flawed philosophers often. Yeah.
Amazing. What is the power and the importance of philosophy, especially in the context of our modern world?
Well, that's a good question, and I mean, there are kind of two ways to really to approach the question. I would say, and there's one is kind of like a slightly utilitarian way of looking at it, and so kind of like what benefit can I get from philosophy? And I think in that sense, there are kind of like two ways. I mean, the first is kind of like in the way it kind of like underpins a lot of other important disciplines. So, namely, ethics feeds into law, and kind of you have politics and you have economics, which are kind of all underpinned by political theory, political philosophy, and kind of economic philosophy. But then I would say also there is a large element of philosophy as therapy, as philosophy as self-help, and that goes back as far as kind of like what we call, in the Western philosophical tradition, as far as Plato and Aristotle, really. I mean, particularly Aristotle, because he started this idea of eudaimonia, what is the best life? Because Aristotle was in the 4th century, he was writing in 4th century Greece, and in the decades or so after him, there was this kind of big explosion of kind of what we call eudaimonic schools, which were all literally in the business of trying to kind of like to sell the idea of happiness and to tell people what was the best form of human flourishing. I mean, you have your Epicureans, you have your cynics, you have the skeptics, and probably the most famous and the biggest, the most popular today are the Stoics, and they took root in that. And each of them are essentially, if you boil them down, are in the happiness business. They're doing psychology, really, and they're trying to say to their disciples, their acolytes, their followers, if you do this, then you will become happy. So, I think there is a big therapy element to philosophy, and I think even that's true of it when you're reading the existentialist and the kind of like the more kind of like modern phenomenologist. So when you're reading like Sartre, for example, he wrote this big book called Being in Nothingness, and it's just full of like anecdotes and stories and examples, which is something that a lot of philosophers at the time and before and around him didn't really do. I mean, it was very hard to pin a philosopher down. It still is quite hard to pin a philosopher down, because the second you use a case study or an example, you kind of open your flank a little bit. Whereas I think Sartre definitely invites that, as does the Beauvoir, as Camus, and as do Gabriel Marcel, all these kind of French philosophers at the time. So so there's the therapy element to it, and but then also I think if you strip away the therapy element, it's just really, really fun. I think I particularly like the analytic philosophy. It was never really my cup of tea. It still isn't really my cup of tea. So we're talking like kind of metaphysics here. We're talking about like meta-ethics. We're talking about epistemology and things like that, which is kind of to do with like Wittgenstein and Austin and kind of all about linguistics stuff. It can be quite dry, and but people just love it. It's kind of like a Sudoku puzzle, and it's kind of logic in a way. And it does unpack concepts. It does unpack ideas. And it's really important within its field, but as a kind of like possibly its cash value, as William James would call it, it has no kind of like real world cash value or application. But even so, even in the process of doing philosophy, even in those walks of life, and in that kind of in those corridors of philosophy, you could argue that that you do find something here. Like one of my all-time kind of like poetic and literary idols is a poet called David Whyte, and he has this quote where he says that if you're when you're the deeper discipline of poetry is that when you're reading poetry, you're going to overhear something about yourself that you didn't necessarily want to hear. And I think that's true of philosophy as well. I think when you're having a philosophical conversation in a seminar or with someone else, or when you're reading a book, sometimes an idea pops up, sometimes a word or a sentence or some controversial point that has been nagging at you just kind of like is unavoidable. And I think that is a really important kind of revelatory kind of aspect to philosophy. So I'm sorry, I'm rambling at you. Do interrupt. Do barge in.
No,
Yeah,
no,
stop me.
not at all, not at all. Did it
Mhm.
surprise you in recent times, this resurgence of interest in, for example, Stoicism? I mean, it really, if you look
Mm.
on Amazon, there are so many books about the obstacles, the way, and so forth. Has it surprised you how much these concepts have resonated with the modern audience?
Um, in some ways, it is quite surprising because I mean, some of the best of it is quite, it's properly philosophical and stuff, and it goes back into some, some pretty dense and pretty hard to understand philosophy from Marcus Aurelius, kind of Epictetus and Seneca and all these people.
Mm.
But in other ways, it's no, because the Stoicism that a lot of people kind of know and understand and apply, it's passed the test of 2.5 millennia really, and it's passed down through generation to generation, and the simplest reason is that it works. I think there is a kind of the evolution of ideas where the ones which are the best and the ones which work do kind of stick around. I think that's true of the religions of the world. Like Buddhism, for example, the Buddha himself didn't try to kind of actively proselytize or kind of convert people. He just said, try it and you'll see it works. And, here we are again, 3 millennia
Mm.
later, and people do still think it works. And Stoicism is definitely like that. So when we have with Aaron Beck I think is in the 60s, 70s, he kind of introduced Stoicism again for a modern audience. And he did so by applying it to what we now know as cognitive behavioral therapy, which is this hugely effective kind of
Yeah.
psychotherapy, which has been proven again and again to help with a range of kind of addictions, neuroses, pathologies, and all sorts of kind of like depression and anxiety. And that kind of controlling your kind of behavior, controlling your thoughts, and controlling your emotions. Yeah, it works, and I think people try Stoicism in that sense, and it really has again this cash value. So in some ways, I'm not surprised about that. As a philosopher, so I went on another podcast a couple of months ago, and they invited me on because I did write once about how it does bother me a little bit how Stoicism is so divorced from its original kind of ancient Greek kind of context,
Mhm.
because yeah, essentially that modern Stoicism today, as a lot of people like and use it, is cognitive behavioral therapy, and that's fine. It's brilliant. It's great and stuff. But if you go back to the original kind of like Epictetus and, as say, Seneca and Stoicism is framed within a slightly more essentially quasi-religious, really. I mean, the Stoics believe that there is this fundamental force to the universe called the Logos, which is like a rational spirit that we all have a part of us within ourselves. And so the reason why you should try to control your emotions and try to be as rational and as virtuous as possible is to essentially get in touch more or with this kind of this logos in the universe. So a philosopher called Alistair McIntyre a few decades ago wrote a book called After Virtue, and he essentially argues that a lot of our moral discourse today is kind of like a simulacrum, or kind of like it's a shadow or a bad representation of what it was or what it used to be. And I think Stoicism is a little bit like that, particularly if you take away the idea of a telos or a telos, your purpose. Stoics were massively kind of schooled this idea that we all humans have a purpose. We have an ideal state. There is an idealized form of humanity. And to actualize that, you have to be virtuous. And to actualize that, you have to be rational, and you have to at least kind of like control your emotions, and at least kind of assent or dissent to those emotions. And I think nowadays, in a kind of a post-World War II, and the kind of like a post-existentialist kind of world, we don't like to talk about the idea of a perfect human or an ideal human or a one path. So I think that kind of those two kind of reasons why. I mean, I get it. I mean, those aren't very popular today, and Stoicism does work. So, in a way, I'm not. So to answer your question again, I've rambled in the way to answer it, but I would say I'm not surprised because it survived the litmus test of time, which is that hundreds of thousands of millions of people have tried it over millennia, really.
Yeah, and it just makes sense. What are some other common
Yeah.
themes that you've discovered across philosophy?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So, when I at university, I kind of like to focus on on the borderlands between philosophy and theology, and also kind of psychotherapy and psychology. And one of the biggest themes which comes up over and over again in a lot of philosophy and a lot of religion is this kind of sense of the dissolving of the ego, a kind of humility, really, in the face of some kind of bigger or greater power. And you have it, of course, you have it in religions. I mean, Islam literally means submission, for example, and in Christianity and Judaism, you know, there's this omnipotent, omniscient God. You know, it's hard not to be humble in front of that, really. And even in Buddhism, for example, you know, there is the ego is dissolvable. You need to kind of get rid of this idea of yourself, and the Christian idea, idea of grace and salvation is essentially the idea that you cannot save yourself unless you kind of submit to God, and that idea of kind of finding happiness when you reduce the ego, that comes up again and again in all sorts of philosophies. You see it in ancient Greece. You definitely see it. You see it with those Stoics and the Cynics and the Epicureans, particularly. They talk about the dissolving the ego. Talk about in Plato, where he says you kind of essentially need to abstract yourself from this world, the physical plane, and you need to kind of essentially embrace what he calls this world of forms, or this kind of like this abstracted pure world. And you have it in Kierkegaard. Again, we talked about Kierkegaard earlier. He essentially says that for your life to have meaning, you need to essentially drift yourself away from your own passions, your own emotions, and your own kind of what you want, and you move gradually up towards what he thinks is religion, Christianity for him. But also along the way, you have to embrace an ethical sphere, he calls it. So where you have to become an ethical person. So Kierkegaard wrote this great book called Either Or, which is kind of like a letter between, or it's a series of letters between one person who's an aesthete, who's kind of living the life of Riley. You know, they're drinking and they're doing all of the drugs you can possibly do, and they're sleeping with all of the women that they want to, because he's a man in the story. And eventually he's writing this letter to another man called Judge Wilhelm. He's basically saying, well, I think you'll get bored of it one day, and don't you want anything bigger? And the overall kind of like feel of the book is that yes, he should want something bigger. I mean, Kierkegaard doesn't explicitly say that. He doesn't kind of pontificate. He doesn't sit on his kind of like on this high horse and say, "Look, guys, you should really live this life." But the book is definitely kind of coloured a certain way. So you have it in Kierkegaard, and then you have it in Taoism in China. You have it in Confucianism as well. This idea that you should dissolve the self. And in fact, you know, in China, it's a huge concept, really. So in Chinese philosophy, your sense of community and your sense of being part of the whole is much more important than you as an individual. There's a Confucian virtue called Li, which is that this is the feeling of happiness and the feeling of fulfillment that you get from serving your part in the whole. And we don't entirely have a Western equivalent to that, because the Western intellectual tradition is largely defined by individualism, which of course has lots of benefits and perks to it. It has, you know, human rights and the rule of law and democracy. So that social consciousness, that social awareness, is it also a part. Essentially, it's the kind of mirror image of the dissolving the ego. Because if you dissolve the ego, what do you have instead? You have either a submission to a metaphysical force, like in religion, or you have an acceptance of your community, and you join a community, and that again pops up again and again. You have in Wittgenstein and Austin in terms of language. Our language is defined by our group. You have it in psychology with people like Vygotsky, and in ethics you have it with Aristotle and McIntyre, and in Hannah Arendt, for example, she talks about a fulfilling life is one which takes place in the forum, in the political setting. So that's one major commonality, I would say, again coming round about to your answer, is that happiness and fulfillment and a flourishing life happens when you kind of like dissolve the self, and you have this kind of humility in the face of something bigger. And I mean, personally, I think that's right. I think,
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I think it can sometimes seem unachievable, especially if you embark on the Buddhist path and you think that I need to completely dissolve and become enlightened. But I like how you framed that. It's humility in the face of something greater, rather than, hey, you have to completely get rid of your ego, which for most of us, I mean, I've tried. I'm not sure that I can get there very fast. I mean, do you think that philosophy can be practiced rather than just being ideas?
I think Definitely so. I think ethics is. I mean, as I say, when it took root in ancient Greece, I think it was definitely a kind of a practice. Really, these eudaimonic schools, Aristotle and Plato were definitely trying to apply that. In fact, Plato had this idea of the philosopher kings as being this kind of ideal leader. And he had an opportunity to actually kind of put that into action. I think he went to, Syracuse. You might need to correct me if that's wrong. But anyway, he was the king of Syracuse basically came along and said, like, teach me how to be a perfect philosophical king or philosopher king. And it went awfully. It went really badly. I mean, he was a brutal tyrant and dictator anyway, this guy. And I think he ended up locking Plato in prison. And I think Plato had to run away. I think Plato said, I'm just going to go out for like a loaf of bread. And then he ended up sailing back to Athens. I think fundamentally philosophy can be applied and can be used. And yeah, in that case, I think dissolving ego is really important. I mean, the other way that again, you have a commonality, and the other way that philosophy is often used is the application of, or the consideration of, suffering and pain and hardships in life. Again, it goes back to the Stoics and the idea of how you can prepare yourself to suffering. And I think later in life, we have kind of someone like Viktor Frankl, for example, and Nietzsche, again, talking about this idea that suffering, or kind of an element of suffering, is an essential and valuable part of developing and growing up. I've always found that a slightly difficult and hard line or hard pill to swallow, because we shouldn't try and suffer. I think like everyone should avoid suffering at all costs. I think we're not a masochistic species. So I think the question is about unavoidable suffering, and also there's an element question about what is essentially kind of a soul making kind of suffering, or what is a soul destroying kind of suffering. Because there's a philosopher called D.Z. Phillips, for example, who talked about no one can look at Auschwitz and the Holocaust and think this was a character building suffering that everyone who survived grew from. It would be much preferable to have a world without that, which is also an idea that Tolstoy picks up in his book, The Brothers Karamazov, as well, where he kind of talks about there's a chapter about the Grand Inquisitor, where they're having this debate, essentially asking about the problem of evil in the world. Why is there suffering? Why is there evil? And one of the characters says, it'll make you better. It'll make you more whole. And I think one of the other characters says, I think if this world involves children being killed and genocide and just like pure wanton cruelty, then I'd rather just not have this free will and the soul making. Just basically take that away, and I'd rather have a world without that. So there is an element of kind of what do we mean when we talk about suffering? What do we mean by talking about pain? Because philosophers have this kind of thing that there's actually a great meme online. I recommend, actually, there's an account called Philosopher Games, where, like, I think basically the idea is that a philosopher has like a small paper cut, like the most insignificant of problems in the world. They wake up early, they had a bad night's sleep, they've got a crook in their neck, whatever, and they say, "Oh, suffering, life is suffering. I shall grow from this. The meaning in life comes from this moment and stuff." And that's not really what suffering is, and that's not definitely what Frankl was talking about. He was a Holocaust survivor, and it's probably not even what Nietzsche talked about. Nietzsche himself was kind of like really paralyzed by pain, because he had these kind of like awful kind of cramps and awful kind of like condition. We don't entirely know what it was. People speculate it might be something like syphilis, which eventually kind of made him mad. But yeah, he definitely had a very hard life, and so that's kind of more what I think we mean by suffering. So I think when philosophers talk about suffering, we can often do something from our very comfy chairs in leafy North Oxfordshire. So, but at the same time, I think there is an element of truth to the fact that some degree of kind of uncomfortability, or being uncomfortable and being struggling, makes you wiser and better for it and stuff. I think I think the wisest people I know in my life definitely have been through some stormy days. And I think when Aristotle talks about phronesis, which is this idea of kind of like practical or kind of the old man wisdom, really. So that's how I used to describe it to my people, as old man wisdom. And I think it only comes when you have experienced a lot of life. You've experienced hardships, pain, and stuff. And I think as if you, for example, need some advice, if you need some help from someone, let's say you're going through a breakup or a divorce and something, like, the person you're probably going to call is someone who's been through that themselves, or been through a similar kind of pain, that they can offer some kind of practical and helpful advice to come out the other side. In psychology, it's called the wounded healer theory, or the Chiron effect. that these people, that therapists and doctors who have been through some kind of degree of pain themselves are better positioned to help others at the other end of it. Yeah, I think philosophy definitely can be practical, and I think it's at its best when it is practical. But I think it bubbles up in strange ways. I think when you read a book in a kind of cold, rational moment on your sofa or in a philosophical seminar, it kind of like it doesn't really kind of go in there and then, but I think it does nestle somewhere into your psyche. I think it nestles somewhere into your unconscious. And I think these words are the words of the philosophers, these ethical ideas, that they will pop up, they will manifest, they will express in some way, I think.
You touched on something, and I'd love to get your thoughts on it, because that concept of free will is suddenly emerging as a hot topic, even amongst scientists, biologists. Like Robert Sapolsky has just written a book about free will. Any thoughts on free will? And I know it's potentially a minefield.
No, it is. I mean, I again, I was talking about the difference in rational and kind of like applied. I think on the rational kind of scientific and intellectual level, I think it's hard to deny that we don't have free will. I don't see what free would look like. I mean, the two options either are we're just biological kind of like dominoes, and our brain has been affected by a combination of our genes and our nurture, neither of which are within our control, and the way I think, the way I talk, the way I behave are just the product of what's gone before. Or you say something like free will exists in this kind of weird quantum gap, that there is a whole like world of quantum mechanics and quantum forces and quantum physics where we don't know what's going on. We don't know, like, for example, Newtonian cause and effect doesn't apply. And so maybe under that kind of great mysterious gap, we can shuffle the remnants of free will. Maybe that will be the case. But I mean, a randomness and unexplained doesn't necessarily equate to free will as I mean it, as I intend free will. And I think I actually kind of tend to agree with what's called the soft determinists, or like Daniel Dennett, for example, where in a way the debate, I mean, there's two debates going on here. There is that kind of like this biological debate and the quantum debate, and there's also the debate about what it feels like to have free will. Because in a weird kind of way, to be free is to kind of accept it's not as if I could have just done anything I wanted. A free choice is me doing what I want to do, and I'm okay with the idea that my wants and my desires and what I prefer in life has been determined by my genetic luck or my upbringing and stuff. So, for example, let's say I choose a certain type of beer. It's probably because of a point in my life that I drank that beer, and it's my culture and my kind of like background and stuff. But yet when I go to the pub and I order that kind of beer, I don't rage against the kind of like the deterministic, fatalistic gods and say, oh no, if only I could choose whatever beer I wanted, because I am choosing what beer I want. So yeah. If that again, probably not answer your question very safe. I've done that kind of philosophical on the fence without speaking, without saying anything.
No, not at all. Yeah, it's an interesting topic, and having browsed, I'm not sure I'll ever read Robert Sapolsky's latest book. I mean, the previous one was difficult enough. It is interesting watching people try to deconstruct some of these ideas, maybe without the support of philosophy. You can get lost in biology if you dig deep enough. So it's really interesting. It's also interesting noticing, influential figures, for example, like Elon Musk, who becomes quite philosophical at a certain point. His ideas transcend science and technology. It's concepts like becoming an interplanetary species and fulfillment and those kinds of ideas. It's really interesting to see this shift.
Yeah. No,
what else? Yeah,
no, I absolutely agree. I mean, so I was going to say, actually, I mean, I think there is actually a big difference between philosophy with a capital P and philosophy with a small p. So I think philosophy with a capital P is the one you do as a subject and as a discipline, and I think that is the one which does involve studying big names and doing kind of like premises to conclusion and doing two-year modules in formal logic kind of thing, and learning what the existential quantifier means. That's kind of philosophy with a capital P. But I think philosophy with a small p, I think, which is arguably the more kind of like important and definitely the more exciting and more interesting for me. I think that can happen with anyone. That can happen at any time. In fact, I've had some of my my best philosophical conversations haven't been in a kind of like a philosophical seminar or with other philosophers. They've often been at that kind of like that certain, well, it's a very philosophical hour. It's like a certain magical hour, like of an evening, for example, when, you know, maybe there is a bit of wine or a bit of beer involved, and it's like, you know, it's late and people are thinking about going to bed, but, you know, you and a couple of other people, you're just sitting there around the table, and suddenly someone asks a big question like, "Hey guys, do you believe in God?" Or, you know, what do you think there's a purpose to this? Or, you know, is it right to do this or that? And it's a kind of question that maybe earlier on in the night would be laughed off, and you kind of like you give a flippant or a kind of sardonic answer to it. But then that time of night, there's a certain magic and there's a certain philosophical element to that. And I think those kind of conversations are deeply and hugely important. And I think that's the start of all philosophy. And I think in those conversations, that's where something shifts inside. Like I've definitely I can think of, you know, they're not many. I can think of them probably on, you know, on less than 10 definitely, but I can think of major conversations like that which have radically kind of changed how I view myself and view the world. And again, I like to think that that's a stage of my intellectual maturing. Like I think some people stick to an idea or stick to a rigid kind of like philosophy throughout their whole life, but those conversations definitely have shattered, well, that idea, but also kind of like really challenged who I thought I am. And I think that philosophy of a small p is arguably more important than philosophy of a big P. But I'm reading a lot about myths at the moment, so excuse me if I can like dipping into a bit about myths. There's an element of needing a spirit guide sometimes. Like, so I write this actually in mini philosophy of the book. I write it in the kind of like at the introduction that I see the book. I mean, some of the negative reviews I've had is that the comment that the chapters are too short, they're too pithy, and that is fair. They are short, and they are pithy. But I kind of view it as being kind of like a signposting. Like it's an introduction to some ideas. And if any of them like resonate with you, if any of them kind of like excite you or kind of get you going, then dive into them more. So when we were in the idea stage for what to call it, my dad called it. Said, "Why do you call it ideological tapas?" And I was like, and we laughed at the time, and we thought, okay, no one's going to call the book ideological tapas instead. But actually, yeah, maybe it's on something like a tasting menu, like a tasting board. You know, you're sampling that. Oh yeah, I like that. Oh, I like this. I like that. And I think maybe like having someone who has studied philosophy with a capital P as a discipline, as a study, it can sometimes help to have that. But I don't think it needs to be university educated. I don't think they need to be philosophy. I think it's someone to say, oh yeah, I read this book about that. Or I think you might want to go reading Schopenhauer. He said that exact thought. Or even you might want to go and, you know, dive into Ibn Sina, who was writing like, you know, in medieval North Africa. So yeah, I think, again, I don't think I answered your question.
It did. Absolutely. And that's how I view your book. I had a look through it, and it is, it's like a tasting menu that provides enough depth to capture you and to explain these ideas. And that leads to my next question, which is, what are some of the most accessible philosophies, or for someone out there who's listening or watching, you know, what are some easy ways to get started into philosophy and discovering these ideas?
Oh, thank. Do you mean as a primary source, as in philosophers like with themselves, or as a kind of like a secondary kind of commentary kind of source? Really?
Yeah, as a secondary source, you know, if someone was contemplating picking up your book, which philosophies, in your experience, have you found are really accessible that people can start to, you know, think about and practice and apply in their own lives? What are some of the most popular ones?
Okay, yeah. So as a primary source, I find Aristotle quite readable. I think he doesn't require too much kind of getting your ear in, because again, as he said to students, that all the philosophers really writing before like the last 20 years, especially if they're not writing for a popular audience, you have to kind of like get your ear into the language they're using and the beat and the rhythm of what they're saying and stuff. And that can take a while. It can take an effort. It can take a slog. So I think that's true. I mentioned Nietzsche at the top of the podcast, and he's one of those people. You have to kind of, you know, get 2 pages in before you can really kind of get your ear in and get going. Whereas Aristotle, I think you can kind of go in from, you know, jump straight in. I think likewise Kierkegaard's like that. Kierkegaard, he doesn't need much kind of getting your ear in. then the existentialists, I think. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote a small kind of like pamphlet / book called Existentialism as a Humanism, which is very readable.
Yes.
And I think Simone de Beauvoir's The Ethics of Ambiguity is also a good way to jump, as is her Second Sex, actually, to be honest. Because they're full of examples. And even if you don't get the technical language they're talking about, kind of like en soi and pour soi and this kind of authenticity and things, and bad faith, mauvais foi and stuff. But they then have an example down the road, and that kind of really grounds the reading. So I think they're great for that. And I think existentialism and ethics generally is quite a neat way to kind of enter the world. But I would also argue that some of the greatest writers of all time are doing philosophy, and they've done, actually arguably they're doing philosophy better than some philosophers. Like I'm thinking like your Tolstoy and your Dostoevsky and your Dickens and stuff, and they're full. And your Victor Hugo, for example. I'm a big fan of Victor Hugo. They're full of philosophical themes, and I think you can pick up a lot from them. And Iris Murdoch, for example, who's a kind of she lives on this borderland between literature and philosophy. And I think she herself kind of littered her ideas between them, as did de Beauvoir actually, but her novels aren't possibly as famous as her philosophy is. So if we're going before 20th century philosophy or 19th century with Nietzsche and Kierkegaard, I'd say someone like Montaigne is probably your best bet. So he's like one of the first kind of like ever diaryists, really. He's kind of like the first kind of like autobiographical thinker. He had this tower in his house. He's obviously quite well off. He has like a tower room which has a library. It's like one of those ideal libraries that I can imagine that if I ever become a millionaire, I would try and like build like a literal ivory tower and live up there with my books. And he just sit there and he just reflect on his day and his mates and the current political climate and his feelings and his love and his kind of passions, and it's really kind of, it's really interesting, and it's like an invitation for you to kind of like to either get on board or kind of like to challenge what he says. But I think most people really, when they read Montaigne, kind of like say, yeah, he's on to a winner. But in terms of secondary kind of texts, I always recommend a guy called Nigel Warburton, I think, and he wrote a book called Little History of Philosophy, and a guy called Think by Simon Blackburn's really good, and a good book called Mini Philosophy by Jonny Thomson. It's really accessible.
This is the one.
I recommend that.
I like it. I like it a lot.
Yeah.
What's a day in the life of a philosopher like? People often imagine philosophers having long white beards and gowns, and they're sitting in a dark room somewhere, poring over books by candlelight. But in our modern world, what's a day in the life of a philosopher actually like?
Well, I think, I mean, I can speak for myself, really. And that's it. At the moment, it's massively filled up by my two young children. I've got a bit of a scandalous confession to make. This is on your podcast. I've only read, I think, 1 or 2 books this calendar year. And that's just because my headspace is entirely kind of like consumed by children, and also writing. And I'm conscious it's bad, but also at the same time, I read a guy called Martin Shaw who's just, again, another one of my literary idols, and he says essentially that there's a time for story reading stories, and there's a time for story making, writing stories. And I think I'm going through a story writing phase. And I'm happy with that. I'm okay with that, because I actually think that when I return to the story reading stage or the philosophy reading stage, I think it'll have a new angle, it'll have a new flavor, and it'll have a new weight to it, a new gravity to it. And yeah, I mean, on that level, I've got 2 kids now, and I've become a ridiculous sock bag since I've had children. Like, whenever I used to read books or movies or any kind of like popular culture about like kids, particularly like if they're dying or if they've anything bad happened to them, I used to kind of be quite flippant about it. It's like, come on, guys, get over it, move on to the fun bit. Let's move on to the vigilante killing stuff. But now I can't stand any of that. Anything like that makes me absolutely blubber. I've completely. Maybe I'm overly empathetic. I'm probably just sleep deprived, but I kind of project myself desperately into everything, and I think that's probably valuable. I think that's important for everyone. I think everyone needs to do a story making period before they can appreciate some stories themselves. Like I think something like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, I hated them. Well, I didn't hate them. I found them very dull when I read them when I was first 18, and I've actually returned to them since in my early 30s. and they're completely different. There's a Roman playwright called Terence who had the quotes where he says like, young boys read books in a certain way, men read books in a certain way, and old men read books in another way again. And I think that's right. So I'll probably pick up the Dostoevsky again in my dotage and on my deathbed, and I'll probably see completely different narratives and themes and signposts that I missed the first time around.
Kids, yeah, that definitely changes your life. Do philosophers tend to rely on, and maybe historical philosophers as well, on substances, alcohol, psychedelics, you name it, in order to remove the filters so that they can explore deeper ideas?
Well, I'm not sure actually about modern. Again, I can only talk for myself. But I know that Jean-Paul Sartre, for example, took LSD in the 60s. In fact, it was like a trend. Like all the intelligentsia were taking LSD. Like, do you remember? So the guy who wrote Aldous Huxley was his name. He wrote a book called The Doors of Perception, which is basically he got high, he took some LSD, and he basically wrote this book about his trip. And because being Aldous Huxley, it was a massively kind of poetic, kind of like amazingly written book. Like, you know, I think if you or I took some LSD and wrote a book, it would be like a incoherent mess of kind of like random words. But yeah, he wrote this brilliant thing. And then Jean-Paul Sartre took it in the 60s, and he had a really bad trip, and he saw crabs following him everywhere in the streets of Paris for about a week afterwards. I suspect that they were definitely into it, but I think other than that, I would argue that maybe not actually. I think there's a certain kind of intellectual purity with some philosophers, someone like Kant, for example, very rigorous, kind of very what would probably kind of like, you know, it's easy to diagnose in the 20th century, but he definitely seemed to have traits of some kind of OCD. Or kind of like obsessions, really. He would go for the same walk every day. He was pathologically terrified of sweating. So he would have like his manservant basically change his sheets if they got the slightest bit of sweat on them, for example. So he, for example, I don't know if he was dry. I think he wasn't dry, but I don't think he would have got boozed up every weekend. But yeah, I mean, as I say, the French philosophers, you can imagine them all sitting around having an apricot cocktail in Paris or two. Yeah, and I'm sure they had some fun philosophy as a result of that. But apart from that, I can't really say otherwise. Yeah, in religion, you see it a bit more, don't you? You see kind of like the idea of a kind of like a holy trip, don't you? This kind of like taking a hallucinogen and walk off into the woods and have your shamanic guide you to whatever kind of revelation you want. What
are your thoughts on figures like Alan Watts, who was one of the, I guess he's been for many an introduction into Eastern philosophy. It certainly was quite transformative in my journey, and particularly in the context of having just had a child. I was struggling with sleep. I was exhausted, fatigued, and then to discover Alan Watts and this, firstly, beautiful way of narrating and speaking, but secondly, it was such a nice entry into some of these ideas that I wouldn't have probably encountered otherwise. At that time, finding the videos or on YouTube or audio files was really quite transformative.
Oh no, I'm a huge fan of Alan Watts. Yeah. So actually, I'm actually alongside myths. I'm going through a big kind of Taoist phase at the moment. I'm very much taken by Taoism, and ironically, when I read a lot about Taoism, there feels like there's some very important meaning and truth there, but it feels like I can't quite grasp it, which ironically sounds like a Taoist kind of tenant or kind of principle, really. And so Alan Watts, he wrote this book called I think it's The Waterway Life, and I've read it about 3 or 4 times. I've got bits which are underlined. I've got the dog ears and stuff, and I've got like massive bits. I've got a whole kind of I've got a WhatsApp group to myself where I message like Taoist aphorisms just to kind of like keep myself a little bit grounded and stuff like that, because they really resonate with me, and I really like the idea of the river analogy of kind of like this kind of going with the flow, which sounds like it's from Woodstock in the 60s. But the idea of kind of again surrendering, going back to surrendering to some kind of force there, and the idea of just being water, that there is a waterway to things, that you can move and you can flow and you can ebb and sway with life. which feels more natural than trying to force your way through. So I wrote about it for Big Think, actually. I wrote about it for both mini philosophy and for Big Ideas, actually. And then the analogy I like is that is the route through the forest. Like if life is like a big forest, there's going to be an easy path. There is a path that feels not natural and feels normal. And that's not to say there aren't other paths. You can take out your kind of like machete and you can bushwhack your way wherever you want and stuff, but it will just be a slog. It'll be hard. So why do that when there is something which does feel more natural, more kind of, right. So I'm very much drawn to Taoism and the Tao Te Ching. Again, I'm not sure how much of time on the podcast. There are elements of Buddhism and Stoicism likewise that I find personally quite hard to digest, whereas Taoism particularly has a siren's call to me, and I find myself pulling closer and closer all the time. Actually, siren's call is a bad analogy because they sing you to your death. So maybe something better, maybe something more kind of like
Maybe something better.
enjoyable.
Yes. Wu Wei is one of those concepts, isn't it? Wu Wei, effortless action. And I kind of like some people tying it towards a kind of flow state, where you've got the skills for the challenge, but you're not overly exerting yourself. To me, that's been, I loved some of those ideas as well.
Yeah, no, exactly. I agree with that. And also I think again, we're talking about commonalities. I mean, these things pop up again and again and again. I think the central ideas of Buddhism, and then you said the Wu Wei, this kind of the waterway life and stuff. You can change the wording as much as you want. You could instead of using the Tao, you could talk about divine intervention. You could talk about fatalism, or you could use psychoanalytic language. You could talk about unconscious forces and unconscious drives and stuff. You could talk about all that and stuff. And essentially, I think it's getting at the same thing, that essentially there is some things feel right and some things don't feel right, and try your best to get in touch with the bits which do feel right. And I think that's just a commonality across all philosophy and religion, really.
And tell me about your Instagram journey. So for those who haven't connected, it's amazing. I've got it on a browser tab right here, Philosophy Minis.
Oh, thanks.
The graphics are incredible. How did you conceptualize these? Do you work with an artist? Like, what's the process?
No, that's me. I just use Photoshop, and essentially, like, I put in a few kind of hard days at the start where I kind of had to kind of draw with tools to like the body parts. Essentially, I draw the heads and the limbs and the arms and stuff like that. And once you got those, you can kind of just kind of copy and paste them into each other and make the perspective. I mean, they're all flat. They're not doing very much exciting stuff. For some harder stuff, I subscribe to a website called Noun Project, where I kind of get some of their logos. All the people, all the men, all their actions and stuff are me. I mean, that came out because when I was teaching some of these ideas to students, I was trying to desperately dig around for like sources where I could give to the students, which would explain the idea in a well-graded language in the way I wanted to kind of like get the idea across. And I realized that actually it'd be quicker and far easier if I just wrote it myself. So actually, a weird phenomenon I found was that it was when I first gave it to students, and if you say you wrote it, they tend to be a little bit kind of like cynical about it, or they didn't switch off. Whereas if you say you found it from somewhere else, they read it a bit better. So actually, I did kind of like, I'm sorry if any of them are listening. I might have lied in those early stages where I said, I found this exciting source. But yeah, so since then I kind of like, I write those kind of those posts, and that's where the book came from, really. They originally started off as kind of just being the really kind of basic tenets of philosophy. So like Kant's deontology and Aristotle's virtue theory and Descartes' cogito and stuff, and then most of those were shuffled off into the mini philosophy book. But also, as you know, I've been doing this for about 3 or 4 years now. The ideas are getting a little bit more niche and a little bit more kind of like from the philosophical B-sides, possibly the ideas which exist in books, but they only exist if you've got to chapter 9 of the someone's 4th book in the series. And yeah, no, I love it. I mean, to be honest, I mean, there's very little kind of like financial benefit to do it nowadays, but I just enjoy the community around it. And I think there is a psychological phenomenon where if you teach something as well, you retain it better. So I find that as I'm researching and reading and writing for those posts, I retain it better. And I find I dig up my own posts sometimes. Actually, I read myself, and I'm reading stuff I wrote 2 years ago, and with the arrogance of me, I kind of like look and I kind of think, wow, this is great writing, Jonny. Well done. This is a great idea. But yes, it's a really fun project, and I'm glad you like it. Thank you for saying so.
Mhm. No, no, absolutely. Uh, Mentioning to the audience your book, Mini Philosophy, a small book of big ideas. For anyone who's interested in connecting with you, what are the best ways? Obviously, following you on Instagram, finding your books on Amazon. Anything else?
Yeah, I'm obviously buying 400 books off Amazon would be great, but otherwise, yeah, follow me on Instagram. I'm pretty responsive to messages on Instagram, or my articles are all on Big Think, and you can email me there at Jonny.Thomson at freethink.com. I'm always happy to talk to people and meet people and hear their ideas, and yeah, love to have conversations about philosophy. So yeah, please do. That would be great. Thank you for giving me the plug.
No, of course. Any final thoughts before we sign off?
No, I mean, I encourage people to go away and read it. And if I had to say one piece of advice to someone is that if a book isn't working for you, not just philosophy, any book really, just don't slog on. Don't just slog on. Find something else. There's enough philosophy. There's enough books written, and there's enough great literature out there that you need to find your one. And I think everyone will find their one. You'll find your person in history. There is your distant avatar in 16th century kind of Morocco, who is your person. You just got to find them, basically. So don't waste time on ideas or books that you don't like. I'd say.
Great advice. Life is short. Keep moving. Thanks, Jonny. It's such a pleasure connecting and exploring some more of your mind. It's an amazing place. I hope we get to do this again at some point. And for everyone out there, please do check out the links in the show note. There's a lot of value there. So thank you, Jonny. Really appreciate your time.
No, thank you, Brad. Thank you.